Good afternoon. My name is Rachel Long, and I'm a second year in the college interning for the Speaker Series team at the IOP. We are pleased to welcome you to a discussion this afternoon regarding the rising power of the Asian American community in our nation's politics. Before I formally introduce our guests, I would like to mention a couple of upcoming events we have the week after Thanksgiving at the IOP and some housekeeping notes. On Monday, November 29th, we will have a virtual event with Fiona Hill, who garnered much attention for her testimony before the House Intelligence Committee during the first impeachment of former President Trump. She will be in conversation with NPR's Mary Louise Kelly regarding Hill's new memoir and the state of geopolitics today. And finally, on Tuesday, November 30th, please join us for our final event of the fall academic quarter, when IOP founding director David Axelrod speaks with retired General Stanley McChrystal in a live taping of the Axe Files podcast. After the moderated discussion today led by IOP Executive Director Zinat Rahman, we will take questions from you and the audience. Please line up behind the microphone to ask your question, and remember, everyone is welcome at the microphones, but please keep your mask on when you ask your question. As usual, we give priority for the first questions to be asked by our students. And just as a final housekeeping note, please make sure that your phones are on silent. It is my honor to introduce our guests for today's event, Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy, Sonal Shah, and Paul Liu. Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy represents the 7th Congressional District of Florida and is the first Vietnamese American woman to serve in Congress. She's currently in her 3rd term in the House of Representatives. Congresswoman Murphy is co-chair of the Blue Dog Coalition and serves on the Ways and Means Committee as well as the Armed Services Committee. Sonal Shah is the founding president of the Asian American Foundation and is a senior practitioner fellow at the University of Chicago Center for Effective Governance based at the Harris School of Public Policy. She previously served as director of the Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation in the White House. And finally, Paul Liu is the chief executive officer of the Chinese American Service League, an organization that focuses on connecting the Chicago Chinese community through broad-ranging initiatives. Mr. Liu previously served as the president of the Vietnamese Association of Illinois and spent a decade with the Boys and Girls Club of Chicago. And moderating this discussion is IOP's executive director, Zinat Rahman. We are very lucky to have our panelists with us here today, so please join me in giving them a warm welcome.
Thank you, Rachel. Welcome to the University of Chicago, welcome to the Institute of Politics, and welcome to all of you for a conversation on all things AAPI. Before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that this has been a tough week for us, given the events of last week and the murder of Dennis Zhang, and who's a graduate student who was murdered last Tuesday. And I wanted to just begin with a moment of silence for him. Thank you, everybody. So I see the conversation today in 3 parts. I would love to just kind of begin with what is AAPI and just get a primer on what is the landscape of what we're talking about. And so as I do that, I'm just curious, how many in the audience would identify as AAPI? So about half of us, maybe. I then want to talk about the increase of hate crimes and the work that's being done about it from our esteemed panelists, and then this issue of rising political power in the AAPI community, and I think also surfacing some of the tensions that come from that rising political power would be great to discuss. Congresswoman Murphy, welcome. I wish she could be with us in person, but we think you were doing something pretty important back in DC this morning, so thanks for being with us. I want to begin by just asking each of you to tell your story. What led you to politics and public service, and to in the work that you're doing right now? And Congresswoman, we're happy to start with you.
Great, thanks so much. And I really wish I was able to be there with you all in Chicago, but this morning we voted on the Build Back Better Act. And so I'm here in Washington, but glad to be with you via live stream or Zoom or whatever it is that we're using. Just a little bit of background from how I found myself to be the first Vietnamese American member of Congress. I My family and I came to the United States in the aftermath of the end of the Vietnam War, as the new communist government was rounding up people who'd been affiliated with the US military or with the South Vietnamese government. My parents were one of each. My parents decided that they couldn't raise children in a country that oppressed their citizens and didn't offer opportunity and freedom. And so we got on a boat to sea, and we ran out of fuel when a US Navy ship found our boat and provided us with food, fuel, and water to make it to a Malaysian refugee camp. And then from there, we were sponsored by the Lutheran Church in Virginia and relocated to the United States, where I had an opportunity to live the American dream, attending public schools and getting scholarships to be the first woman in my family to go to college. And that moment for me has defined my life and my perspective, and what drives me. It is a moment where I understood very clearly what makes America great, and it is the combination of power and generosity. It's a power that allows U.S. Navy to patrol the waters thousands of miles from home to ensure international commerce and safe travel at sea, but it's the generosity that is so much a part of what America is about, that enables men and women trained for combat to decide to extend grace to desperate strangers. And so I owe this country a huge debt of gratitude, and I try to pay it back through public service. First, after 9/11 at the Department of Defense, and now in my role as a member of Congress, trying to serve my constituents in Florida and do what's right to move this country forward. And really just proud to be an Asian American in the halls of Congress, because I've always said that representative government needs to reflect the great diversity of this country. So thanks so much for having me today to have this conversation.
Thank you. Sonal?
Well, like the Congressman, I'm also a first-generation immigrant. I came here when I was 4 years old, though, and my parents emigrated from India to come to the U.S. I started off actually working in policy, so I wanted to go work in Washington, D.C. I wanted to be a development economist. I just didn't get the job. So I ended up at the Department of Treasury as a
Well, also you're an undergrad from
I am
your
a
alma.
U of C undergrad, so the most important part of the bio, which wasn't mentioned, which is this is my alma mater. I am way older than you guys, but I graduated here in 1990. But I wanted to be an economist, and I wanted to be a development economist. I wanted to do international development, and ended up at the Department of Treasury. And through a series of jobs and things, I ended up on the political side of government. So there's the civil service side, and then there's the political side. And through a series of different things, I ended up on the political side, and since then have been fairly active in politics, but recognizing that policy, politics, civic engagement are all sort of part of a continual spectrum, and have been lucky enough to work in civil society, have been lucky enough to work in academia, have been lucky enough to work in the private sector, but also in government for a significant chunk of my career. So I have learned a lot in the process, but I think what I've learned probably the most about is the importance of civic engagement, and having worked overseas in a lot of countries, the importance of democracy and the civic engagement aspect of it.
Yeah. I hope you'll at some point talk about that, how you went from policy to politics to government, because I think a lot of our students are curious about what those categories even mean.
Yeah.
And Paul, last but not least.
Well, I have a similar story as Congressman Murphy. My family and I are from Vietnam. We're Chinese Vietnamese descent. After the war, my father was working with the U.S. military. Actually, many of my relatives and uncles were a part of the military. And when the fall of Saigon happened, really the country fell. And we were considered the boat people. And many of you may not know that the UN High Council estimated about 450,000 Vietnamese passed away and perished at sea as they migrated out of Vietnam. Oh. So I left with my father, my mother, and again, same thing with the Congresswoman. Our boat was stranded on an island, saw many people who suffered and died. We were so fortunate that we were able to go to Hong Kong, and my mother being Chinese, we were able to stay in Hong Kong refugee camps where we, like many refugees, slept on the floor for a year. And a 6x6 wooden panel. My father worked for 7 days a week, living in factory floors and making ends meet. We were fortunate enough, and again, same thing with the Congresswoman. We were sponsored by a Presbyterian church, and with my uncle, who left earlier before the fall of Saigon. It brings great memories and really painful memories back
How old
then.
were you?
I was almost 4, and I was at 2 years old. I was on the streets of Hong Kong selling trinkets until 1 o'clock midnight to help the families. There are a lot of similar stories as mine, but very thankful for the Asian American leaders that have been in my life and who really have embraced who I am and embodied their identity, and then to really support me through my career. I've been in the nonprofit space for all my career. As mentioned earlier, I've been in the Boys and Girls Club, but I think what I really cherished most as my career elevated was at the very beginning, I was able to work at a little small place called the Refugee Center, or Cermak and Urbana-Champaign. It was phenomenal because the Asian American leader, all women who were just there to say, our mission, our passion is to serve the API community, and we do whatever we can to help them. So they shaped me, and being as a refugee and immigrant, I have embraced who I am a while back. And so I understand the challenges, not just with API refugees, immigrants, but also any refugees who come to this country and the challenges. And so I want to be there not only just for a voice, but to help them move on and to make a better life in this country. So again, very thankful to be here to share the story.
I'm very thankful to all three of you for sharing your story. And Sonal, I think as president of the Asian American Foundation, will you give us a sense of like this huge, landscape that is AAPI communities, like religion, ethnicity, all demographics?
So there are 23 million Asian Americans in the United States, fastest growing population in the US. I think too often we think of everybody in different groups. When we think about the full aspect of the Asian American community, it's 23 million. We are 50 different ethnicities, 20 different Pacific Islander communities. So there's no one Asian American community. There are many different Asian American communities. There are many stereotypes about us. I want to just address a couple of those stereotypes, that we are the model minority. Everybody in the Asian American community is successful. Everybody in the Asian American community is wealthy. When you look at the macro numbers, that's what it shows. But when you start breaking down the data, you also realize that the highest disparity in income is amongst Asian American communities. Of any other ethnicity, the highest disparity of income is amongst Asian American communities. We are a very diverse community. We also receive 0.5% of the resources of any foundation. All foundations combined, Asian American communities get 0.5% of resources. 7% of the population, 0.5% of the resources. Less than 1% from corporations. Many times in government, we're not even considered. The needs aren't even considered. Language access, hate crimes reporting, hate incident reporting. How do I know what's happening with COVID if we don't have that? Many times Asian American communities are not thought through in those concepts. So when we created the foundation, our job was to understand how to bring the Pan-Asian community together. We are not the Chinese American community or the Indian American community. We are the Pan-Asian community. And to figure out how we bring communities together, how do we stand for all of the communities and the needs that they have, but understand that collectively we are a stronger organization than individually as our community. Celebrate the differences, but bring people together to address the issues. And our goal is to do that. We just launched on May 3rd, and we are all of 6 months in.
You and me both. Congresswoman Murphy or Paul, do you have anything to add to that? Would you like to add anything to that?
I would love just to emphasize what Sana says. Working in the community, we are the Chinese American Service League, but we don't not only serve Chinese, but all Asian American, but also anyone who walks into our building who needs support. I think it's really important for, as an Asian American, to recognize and to embrace that the beauty about our community, you know, the API community, is our diversity, and that we need to support each other. And so for so long that because of history, rhetorics, and so many other elements that throughout this history of the United States, there's been a continual divide, and we gotta support each other. So as a community leader and working in the nonprofit space, I always encourage working with each other so that we can support not just the Chinese, but the Koreans, the Japanese, the Vietnamese. That's so important during this time right now.
So you referenced this time right now, and I think, you know, obviously what has awakened in American consciousness questions about who the AAPI community is this, well, first the horrific murders in Atlanta that happened, what, 18 months ago, 2 years ago, but then the surge in hate crimes. And so, and I didn't even, I mean, I was shocked reading that Asian hate crimes rose by 76% from 2019 to 2020, according to the FBI. But in New York City, 335%, according to NYPD crime statistics. And then there's this feeling amongst Asian community, American community members that 1/3 of them fear that violent attacks and threats against them are rising. What is going on? Like why, you know, what do you think is driving the surge? And how is your work addressing the issue? Congresswoman Murphy, I'll go to you because I feel like you have something to say, yeah.
Yeah, I do. And let me just first share with you a personal story. So COVID happened. We sort of shut down in March of 2020, and we saw the first, the beginnings of the Asian hate crimes happening at that point. And I was recalled to Washington to vote on a massive COVID relief package. And I remember going to take a flight when nobody else is flying, and being concerned about my safety from the parking garage of the airport to the terminal. And there had been the one incident where they had thrown acid on somebody. And here I was, a sitting member of Congress, returning to Washington to provide economic relief for the country in the midst of a pandemic, worried about my own safety getting from my car to the airport so that I could go serve the American people, some of whom were engaged in racist and racially motivated attacks on Asian people. And I think for me, that was this moment that was like so stunning, because I grew up in Southern Virginia. I have certainly experienced my fair share of racism and discrimination, but it was breathtaking, I think, for me to be in that moment and to see that the community was being wrongfully vilified and punished for something that, you know, we had nothing to do with. I mean, Asian Americans didn't have anything to do with the start of the pandemic, and yet our safety and security was at risk. And I think for all of the acts of discrimination that I think our community has faced, I still believe that on the whole, America is a place that has opportunity and space for diversity. And it's incumbent upon us as leaders not to let the negative overwhelm the positive. Because in my 40-some years here, I've had far more people reach out and mentor me and help me and lift me up than I have had moments like the one I had in April of 2020, headed into the airport headed back to Washington. And I think it's important that as a community we hold on to that, but that we also speak out in a unified way against these acts of hate crimes.
I think it's also important to recognize that just hate crime not only increased by 76% to the API community in the last year, but there are other hate crimes that are not reported. And the ones who experience hate crime need that voice, that need that support so they can report these hate crimes. I truly believe that number is a lot larger than it's reported. And so, and then the other thing is also the small microaggressions that the Asian Americans experience, and that's not reported and that's not identified as, sometimes hate crime. As an agency, we have 600 employees. We're the largest API organization in the Midwest. We have staff all over the city of Chicago and Cook County. And as they're going about their business to serve the community and the families, at times they have to take public transportation. They experience the microaggression. They feel intimidated. They feel threatened when someone look at them in a very scary way. I have staff who have said to me and reported that I got spit on. And as an American, that should never happen. So all these aggression towards the Asian American community, it has to stop, but it has to stop in a way that we as a community cannot just work with ourselves, but we have to ally ourselves with other community, like the Black and brown communities, the ones who also understands the struggles that we're going through, and that we can work together, to help each other. So that's really important. One more thing, a little data, is we're a big data organization, and we love data.
Chicago loves that.
Yeah. So we pivot on data, and we have a big data platform. But we surveyed our clients, and of last year, through the 2020, our Asian American women, they felt 22% felt less safe walking the streets in their community. That's scary. And so we want to make sure that we're collecting these data, we pivot and create actions to support these challenges as we move forward. And we can only do that, it's not just with ourselves, not within our buildings, but reaching out to partners who believe and have the same values of stopping hate, not just for our community, but all communities. And that's really important for us to understand.
I think it's important to recognize that while we're seeing anti-Asian hate now, it's not the first time we're seeing this, right? In 1982, Vincent Chen was murdered in Detroit for being, he was a young man leaving a bar from his bachelor party. Yeah. It was during sentiment against the Japanese American companies because of the Detroit car industry wasn't doing well and the Japanese car industry was doing well. They thought he was Japanese American, so they murdered him. And that was when the community actually galvanized. I mean, it was actually one of the earlier pivot points of when our communities galvanized. 9/11 for the Muslim American community, right? There were lots of hate crimes, not only against Muslim Americans, but Sikh Americans. And there were moments of time where we've galvanized on points, but to really think about, we're seeing this constantly, how do we work together to address this? And that takes time and effort. So one part of addressing what we're talking about is addressing anti-hate. How do we collect the data? How do we report the data? How do we make sure we're protecting our communities? The second part of this is how do we create belonging?
Yeah.
Right? And that's a much more powerful part of this, which is prevention is belonging. And we have to work with communities to figure out how belonging actually works and making that happen. So it's why we're partnering with Castle, TAF is. We realize we need to create regional centers where this happens and local centers. We can be a national organization, but we need regional partners where trust is actually where the communities are and what to do that. So we're piloting 3 cities, Oakland, Chicago, and New York City, to say how do we create regional centers to both places where the community can go to when something happens. How do you report? How do you have conversations? What can you do? I mean, I don't know about many of you, my parents wouldn't even know what to do. So what can you do? How do you do it? And then more importantly, how do we build relationships within the communities to make that happen? And we're gonna learn. I mean, I think that's why we're partnering locally, because it's not just a national response. It's not just a hate crimes bill.
No.
It's actually knowing what you can do at a very local level. What happens to you? If something happens to you, where do you go? Who do you talk to? Who gives you advice? Which lawyer can you talk to? All of those things. Where can I get mental health services? All of these things are actually very important in a collective. And I think that's something that, as we think about this and as we think about AAPIs and anti-hate, it's a full service effort. It's not just it's not just about the hate incident. It's about everything that comes along with that.
Can we touch really quickly on the role of like culture and narrative? Because I think this is about the AAPI community, but really it's about the definition of what it means to be American.
Correct.
And what happens in our big tent of a community is which way the story goes of what it means to be American. And as you said, identity is a big part of that. And I think this narrative about like who tells your stories, because we are considered the silent community or the model minority who doesn't have a voice or agency. And so what are your thoughts about like what is it that changes that, or so that those stereotypes and microaggressions diminish? Because you have to create a culture. I mean, there's mood music by which hate crimes happen.
Yeah.
And those of us from the Muslim American community are very familiar with this. It's like a similar playbook, that we saw play out in our communities. And there are drivers that are driving those. We don't have to belabor that, but how do we change that? Shift that perception?
Well, I would like to start. I think it's, many of you may already know that Illinois, passed the Teach Act. And, Council, our organization was a part and a big push through the state of Illinois. So the state of Illinois is now the only state in the union that's, requiring that Asian American education or history must be taught, right, in our schools. I think that's really important. It's about the education, so that it's just not for the representation of our children or API children, but other children who understands the API history, the experience. And when we look through that process, we all really have almost the same experience, the same challenges. And so as children are understanding the history of API, hopefully that would bring some of the cycles and challenges moving forward. So we're extremely proud to be a part of that process. The other thing is going really back is just how do we ally ourselves with allyship to others in the community. So from a community base, we partner with many other well-known organizations that have like values. So it's just not the API communities, but the Black and Brown leaders in the city of Chicago that we must work with so that we can have a collective voice as we move forward. And that's really critical. The final thing is, I think it's really important for Asian American leaders is that they have to believe that and trust that they have a voice in this platform. And it's really important for them to speak up and speak out and speak together on the challenges with this. So API leaders now are more and more being more vocal about the challenges that our community faces each and every day.
I want to address narrative change from 3 different perspectives. So one is just representation matters. So you need a Representative Murphy, and we need many more Representative Murphys, to be fair, at every level of government. We have Michelle Wu, who's now the mayor of Boston, but we need many more people running for office at city council, school boards, state representatives, national representatives. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Education happens at every level, and every level matters. Being in Chicago, it's important that you are at the local government here, as well as representing the government here at the national levels. All of it matters. Second is narrative change in the media.
Yeah.
Let's not be unclear. The media has a narrative about Asian Americans. And that narrative is that we don't speak up, that we're the model minority, and we're the perpetual foreigner. And perpetual foreigner meaning that we're always not American. We must not be loyal Americans. And we have to hold that accountable, and we have to change that media narrative to say, when that happens, to have people ready to be spokespeople to go speak on TV, to go speak on the radio, to make sure we're ready for that. And then the third area is TV. So Define American, which is run by Jose Antonio Vargas. He's a Filipina, undocumented actually. Fascinating, but what they're working with is they're working with scriptwriters in Hollywood to make sure that every time AAPI representation is shown in Hollywood, that we're not just seeing a particular type of minority being represented, but actually that we're everything, right? We're musicians, we're artists, we're doctors, we're police officers. We're in all parts of life. We're not just A, B, or C, which is where we generally get pushed and defined into roles. But I think those are important places for narrative change to also happen. There's local, but there's also these national trends that happen when you see how those narratives are affected. People watch that.
Yeah. Yes, Congresswoman, please.
And just to add to just a couple points on those three things that my co-panelists just said is on narrative, you know, a lot of the narrative that has engendered the anti-Asian hate has been driven by the politics. So here in Washington, if there's something that there is bipartisan consensus on, it's an anti-China, anti-CCP, the Chinese Communist Party sentiment. But unfortunately, because some of my colleagues are loose with their rhetoric, that has become an anti-Chinese and then an anti-Asian and unfortunately, anti-Asian American. So they have allowed the acknowledgement of what is a key competitive issue for the United States to have bled into the persecution of Asian Americans. And that makes us weaker as a nation. And I've put out op-eds and really trying to push back on this narrative because it is so damaging to us and it only empowers Beijing. And so we have to be more, as electeds, more careful with our language around this so that it doesn't bleed out the way that it has. On politics and on Asian American involvement, and I'm not trying to speak in generalizations and kind of generalize Asian Americans, but I'll speak from my personal perspective as a refugee and an immigrant and a woman, an Asian woman. My parents raised me not to speak up. The nail that sticks up gets pounded down is the sentiment that culturally I was raised in. And culturally, as a refugee, just grateful to be here, having escaped a country where you were persecuted for speaking out. My parents instilled in me, keep your head down, do not draw attention to yourself, get a good education, focus on that and be a good citizen. But being a good citizen didn't encompass running for public office. I think that's a hurdle and maybe a cultural obstacle that we have to get over in order to see more representation at the local, state, and federal levels. And I'm heartened by the elections in Boston, and I'm heartened to see more Asian Americans engaged. But I do think that we have to acknowledge that there's an element of a cultural barrier to doing the things that are necessary to run for public office. You have to ask people for money.
Right.
You have to brag about yourself. You have to want to be in the limelight. And all of those things are counterintuitive, at least to my Asian upbringing. And it takes a lot to kind of overcome those kind of cultural barriers and put yourself out there. But I think we have to do more of it. And then finally, on inclusion, I think when we talk about allies, we have to get our allies to see us also as a minority. I can't tell you the number of times that my colleagues will talk about advocating for minority groups, and they really only mean Black and brown people. And they will tell me that. They will say to me, whether it was the National Defense Authorization Act and and what they thought was discrimination. And I said, surely you mean Asian Americans too? And they said, no, not Asian Americans, because you all don't get into the same kind of trouble. And so we're not extending equity to you. And I think that's really problematic. We cannot have a conversation about equity and then distinguish between the shades of color of minority groups. And that means that as good as reliable of allies that we are to these other communities, they also have to be reliable allies to us.
I want to pick up on that because we talked about it in the green room before we came in, and I know right now in Chicago there's this push towards from the Chinese American community, but others as well, like to have a majority Asian ward, and there's been pushback, right? Because that would mean, anyway. Do you want to talk about just the tensions between the Asian American, the AAPI community, and other minority communities?
Yeah, sure. Well, I just want to, well, right now the city of Chicago is in a redistricting map for the wards, and it's a historical time. You know, in the city of Chicago, the API community has increased drastically in the last 10 years, and we really have the right and really should deserve an API ward. So in the Chinatown Chinese community, we're looking to see how we can draw a map to have an API ward. And the challenge is that in the city of Chicago, we're not at the table. We're not able to be in the city hall to be a part of the conversation with all the elected officials. There's no API representation in City Hall. And in the 200 years of the city of Chicago City Hall, there's only been one elder person who's identified as an Asian American. So we're not at the table to speak on behalf of our community. And so we have set rallies, we have provided op-eds, we have talked to every older person to support this, because the need is really important. Not only our community is growing, but the needs of our community is changing. And so going back to Sano said, that we need someone in City Hall that looks like us, not just looks like us, but understands our culture, who we are, and the challenges that our community faces every day. Language issues, healthcare issues, access to opportunities, growth, and so on and so on. So if we're not able to have this ward, then there goes another 10 years of challenges in our community. Yeah. And so that's really important. If you think about this from a different lens, and you take the city of Chicago out, when you look at New York, Seattle, Houston, San Francisco, actually they have representations of API representation in wards and elected official. And when you look how they speak and champion for the community, it's a healthier community. And so what we're asking is that we're trying to work with the Black and the Latino caucus to say, you understand the challenges. You yourself and your community understands the challenges too. So please be an ally with us to create this ward, because there are tens of thousands of people who need support. So that's really important.
So we're going to move to Q&A in 1 minute, so just have your questions ready. You can begin to line up at the mic. And so both the Congresswoman and Paul, kind of at the national level and then the very local level, surface these tensions between Black, Brown, and AAPI communities. What are your thoughts around how we reconcile and move forward, and even talk about them? Because I don't think we often have space to talk about.
I think we have to talk about it,
yeah.
Right? And we sort of sweep it under the rug. We're just like, all communities of color are in line in agreement on X, Y, and Z, and we're not even talking about it. We're not even having the conversation that there are real tensions. To address tension means you have to talk about the tension, right? Other countries where I've worked, truth and reconciliation was actually a conversation. You had to have a truth in order to have a reconciliation. But to pretend like the truth is everybody's all on the same page is not a truth. And what we need to have is have some of these tough conversations And even within the AAPI communities, we need to have these tough conversations because we're not all in alignment on this. And we need to have this conversation because if we don't, we're going to sweep issues under the rug. And the Congresswoman talked about it in Congress. We see this in nonprofits. We see this in businesses. DEI means non-AAPI. Many companies didn't even have AAPI representation at DEI conversations. And because they're like, well, Asian Americans get in the door, so therefore they're not part of a minority, what happens, and one of the things that all of us do not know about is we may get in the door, we don't get promoted. Our promotion rate is 1.2% in companies. Keep that in mind, 1.2%.
Wow.
Right? So yes, you know about the CEOs that are Asian American and all of that, 1.2% in management. So we have to understand that getting in the door doesn't mean you stay. Getting in the door means you get in the door. And that these conversations, it might be different DEI conversations for different communities, but we have to have these conversations. What we're all fighting about is 1%. Every community, Latino, African American, Asian, we're fighting over 1%. The 99% pie we're not even fighting about. We're carving up 1% amongst ourselves and fighting about who got access to that 1%. Joined together, we get to think about 99%. Fighting against each other, we're fighting on 1%.
Yeah. Happy to take the first question. And if you could say your name and year, major.
My name is Sam Chen. I'm a first-year medical student here. And I just want to start by saying thank you so much for all coming here. As someone who identifies as mixed-race Chinese American, I think it's really important and impactful for me to see people who look like me, who look like my family, up there talking about the issues that are facing our communities. And I think my question is sort of related to the last question that was asked, but maybe filtered through a more specific Chicago-centric lens here. The tragic loss of Dennis Zheng last week has been met with increased calls for security on campus, especially from some members of the Asian community. And what that looks like very materially is more police on campus, which runs contrary to some of the demands from Black and brown communities last year for divestment from police and investment in the community of Hyde Park, of the south side of Chicago. And growing up in an Asian American household, I know firsthand some of the very real strains of anti-Black, anti-brown racism within at least my family, and I think some of the wider Asian American community as well. And so I'm curious, as community leaders, as elected representatives, how do you work within your own communities to bridge some of these gaps, to change the way that we relate to each other so that we can have sort of pan-racial solidarity instead of feeling like we're being pitted against each other?
Wow.
Great question.
That's a great question, Sam. I think it's really important for us to recognize first from our community, like you mentioned, and you recognize yourself within your family, the challenges that you grew up with. And that's really important that we reflect within our own community, our own family, the challenges, and identify those challenges and work within ourselves first. So as an organization like ours, like Castle, we recognize the challenges because we have these challenges. And so we made the financial investment in the strategic plan to bring in DI&A to Castle and then work within our core and our core values so that we can transform to become a better agency. And many of our employees live and work and play within our community. Our goal is to then move forward and move out in the exterior and into the community and to educate our community members the challenges. It's not easy. I mean, it really is not easy, and it takes time. So what we have done is start having some of those difficult conversations internally. And that's, going back to Sana, what he's saying is that we have to have that conversation before even talking about to other community members and allies, because we don't understand some of the challenges we have. So that's what we're doing, and it's going to take some time. The other thing is that I've been talking to many, many other leaders that are non-API leaders in the city of Chicago and saying, how can we work with each other? We understand where your stance are about Chicago Police Department and your values, and our community sees it differently and our staff sees it differently. But where do we need to have those hard conversations to work together, because we can't do this alone. So I've been having a lot of conversations, Sam, with a lot of the executive leaderships about how can we work together. And it's very tricky, right? Because our community is saying more police, our community is saying we're going to arm ourselves. And I was just telling Sano just last night and others, our community is saying we're going to arm ourselves, and anyone who comes into our community that doesn't look like us and causing problems, we have the right to take action. And we don't want that, right? And so we want to make sure we educate our community, the challenges they're facing, and then embrace the diversity of the city of Chicago also. It's a really good question, but I can say, it's going to take a lot of time.
To Congresswoman Murphy or Sonal, do you have a response, or we can, if you don't, we can move on?
I will just say, for many of you especially, and including ourselves, we're bridge conversations. So there's there's also a generational difference that's taking place here between first gen and second gen. And I think you're gonna have to bridge those conversations, right? Because our parents didn't have a choice to go anywhere when they lived in this country. So Congresswoman Murphy talked about her parents as like, there was no choice to go anywhere. If something happened, there was no other place to go. They were living in the United States and they've created communities. But now we have different perspectives because we have education, we have other information in a way that sometimes our parents did not. And we're gonna have to learn how to bridge those conversations. It's easy to be angry at our parents and not understand where they're coming from. And it's easy to say, well, you have to understand all of this, but we're gonna have to be a bridge, and we're gonna have to understand how to translate what is happening as historical changes and what's happened in history, which hasn't been taught that well, to be fair. And then how do we bridge those conversations? And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to think about how are we as bridges going to address those conversations and bring our communities together. But it's long term. There's no short-term solution to this. Like, I want to be clear, it's going to look bad until it gets better, but we're going to have to go through the process. If we ignore it, it's worse. So it's addressing it and being a part of it.
Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Taryn Kim. I am a first year at the college, and I've recently been very inspired by the increased voter turnout that I've seen coming from the Asian American community. And I was wondering, what are some of the methods that you guys believe have spurred on this increased civic engagement? And, despite cultural differences within the API community, despite some of the complacency that perhaps are instilled in some Asian Americans, how do we continue to consolidate and build this Asian American voting bloc?
Congresswoman Murphy, happy to go to you first.
Sure. I think obviously the being a victim of hate crimes and the experience that Asian Americans have had over the last year and a half or so during the pandemic motivated them to have a voice within our political system, because it's just such an important thing, and there's nothing like personal safety and security to sharpen the mind and motivate folks. But now that we are seeing Asian Americans engaged and coming to the polls, as electeds, we have to deliver on the things that they care about. And beyond the identity pieces of being Asian American and the experience we've had over the last year and a half, Asian Americans care about healthcare and the economy and education. And so how do we as electeds meet the Asian American community where they are on these various issues? And whether that's, the economy and entrepreneurship, or the ability to care for your own family, or education, which is part of the Confucian ethos and is a big part of Asian American culture. How do we meet folks there on this? And then I think the other thing is not to take for granted that Asian Americans are by default Democratic voters. They're not. And in fact, Vietnamese Americans, like the older generation, are reliable Republican voters. And so, how do we help articulate that the Republican, what the Republicans are offering right now in this moment in our political discourse, What the Republicans are offering is authoritarianism. And that's what Vietnamese Americans escaped from, but yet they still don't see the party through that lens, right? Despite the fact that the Republicans, that's what they're offering is, putting people in power and keeping them in power. And so how do we tell the story and from the meta level of what's at stake here? Because Republicans have very successfully associated the Democratic Party with socialism. And so this generation of Vietnamese Americans, the older generation, are like, we don't want to have anything to do with socialism, but they don't see the authoritarianism in sheep's clothing, basically, that the Republicans have. And so we have to be able to expose that. And then we have to meet people where they are on the issues that matter around education, the economy, and healthcare in order to not only have AAPI show up, but to show up and vote in a way that is meaningful to advancing the community.
Can I just add to that person?
Yeah, just, yeah.
Civic engagement is a lot of work.
Yeah.
Right, so going into the communities, engaging people, getting people to register to vote. One part is getting people registered to vote, and then it's asking them to show up to vote. And it's a constant. So what happens sometimes, I think, in our communities is we sort of do it in large elections by large elections, but we don't do it in constant elections. And so we have to make sure that we understand why it matters to participate, why it matters to be in different parts of voting. Again, city council is just as important, because when you think about how much money goes from the federal government to cities and localities, we're not even in that conversation, where we're not even asking for the resources that should be coming to us. So why civic engagement matters in this is that not only do we need to vote, we also need to participate in every aspect of it, sitting on the city council for redistricting, sitting on the city council for DEI. All of those pieces matter in engagement. So if we're gonna do civic engagement, let's ask our communities to participate at multiple levels, not just voting every 2 years or every 4 years, but actually at every other time where it actually matters too.
Yeah, I would like to add to that also. I think to build on what you said, how do we build upon this? And I think it's really important to embrace the younger leaders who have put their sweat and tear and heart and get the voters out. And as leaders, and such myself and others, we have to bring these young leaders into our spheres of influence, and embrace them, and then help them through the process, and for them to be leaders too. So we have a responsibility, all API leaders, to say, we need to look at the generations coming behind us, that now they're active and involved, and they're asking how can they be more civically minded, right? So we need to help, not just shape, but allow them to influence the policies and the things that are happening in this country, but also to set them up for success. And that's really important.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
Do you want to just take 2 in a row?
Yeah, we'll take 2 in a row. And then you guys can just wrap up and close too at the same time.
Hello, my name is Noelle. I'm a master's student with the Committee on International Relations, and thank you so much for all of you for your work in public service, as well as with Representative Murphy and the work that you've done after January 6th. My question is regarding the role of domestic violence, sexual assault that a lot of Asian American community has been facing. Back at home, I work with a nonprofit that helps survivors of this very area, and I wanted to know if there's any way that you see with your roles how to assist in creating change in that area, making sure that there's further outreach and help being navigated for survivors. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the last question.
I'm Ranjana Bhargav, and probably the oldest person here. But when I came 54 years ago, we were never recognized as Asian Americans. Having worked with 5 nonprofits, with a lot of corporates, what Paul has done is what I have done in my earlier years. My question to you is that the younger people are not even thinking of themselves as Asians. They are thinking of assimilation. In order to think about that, they have to think of who am I and what can I contribute. My contributions, along with my daughter, have been, and my son, have been to make things possible for all of us, especially Asian Americans. And that is something that I want you to address.
Sure, I think it goes back to about self-reflection, and being coached and mentored and shaped to who I am as an API leader today. The other thing I think is really important is about what we just talked about throughout this hour is about representation. Representation matter. And so in the state of Illinois, we passed the Teach Act. So our children are now being able to see their history in the history book, right? And just recently, TAF and their leadership helped work with Sesame Street. There is actually an Asian Muppet on Sesame Street. And so for young individuals to see that and they're and embracing who they are, right? That could help them also to say, well, you know, I don't have to be a doctor. I don't have to be a lawyer. You know, I grew up wanting to be a doctor also, but because of having those amazing leaders in my life in the nonprofit space and being involved and being civically engaged, it really allowed me to say, yes, this is where I want to be, to do good in my life and to do good in the community. So I think that's really important. To go back to about the sexual assault and domestic violence, I just want to encourage everyone to be involved into the nonprofit space. There's organizations like Can Win. You know, they fight and they help survivors. So it's really important for us to say, yes, we want to learn, but how do we take action, get trained? How do we recognize the challenges with domestic violence and help survivors? So organization, again, like Can Win, is a great organization to be a part of.
Thank you. Congresswoman Murphy, I'll go to you and then Sonal to close.
Sure. You know, and I have to admit that I was one of those people that the questioner mentioned, somebody who was Asian American who was desperate to assimilate. I grew up in a all-white community in Southern Virginia, and as a child, there was nothing more that I wanted than to just blend and to be accepted. And so I never talked about my parents and my personal story. And it wasn't until I decided to run for public office and started sharing this story that I understood the power of owning my race, because it empowered other people. And I remember the first time a young person came to me and said, it means a lot to me to see somebody who looks like me in the place that you are, you know, in the halls of Congress, at the table, advocating not just for the interest of the Asian American community, but for Americans writ large. And I think it was in that moment that I realized how important it was to own my race and to own my personal story. But I have to say that it was a difficult journey to get there, because when you're growing up and you're in your teen years or you're a child, all you want to do is to fit in. And I think it's important that we have electeds and leaders in the nonprofit, in the business sector, or in politics who can comfortably own their stories so that the next generation can feel comfortable in their own skin.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the first question on violence against women in the Asian American communities, I think there are multiple organizations out there. It's also why we funded NAPAF, National Asian American Women's Forum, because we think it's important that we recognize that women, especially in the Asian American community, face certain challenges. And we need to talk about violence against Asian American women. We need to talk about what is happening in our own communities, but also to address that, because to prevent it, again, means to talk about it. And we have to talk about it in order to prevent it. So it shouldn't be a shameful thing. We have to just talk about what's happening and how do we address those and how can we get to The second question, Mrs. Bhargava, first of all, for those of you that don't know her, she is an incredible leader in the Chicago community, has been doing a ton on the South Side, especially against violence against women. But her daughter, Anurima Bhargava, was at DOJ and probably one of the leading civil rights lawyers in the government at the time. So huge thank you for everything that you have done, but also for just your daughter doing so much too. So thank you for your leadership. That question is, it's more than just about assimilation. It's about who are we? How does our identity define us as Americans? Not as how does our identity separate us as Americans, right? We are American. First and foremost, we live here, we participate here. We are part of writing this American story. It's not a story that's happening to us. It's a story that we are actually participating in. You have to believe that. Every aspect of who we are, where our parents came from, where our histories are, all of it matters because that is the beauty of America if we can get this right. If we can get this right, what matters is we're writing a story of America where our individual identities and our collective identities are both important, and that we stand for something together that is greater than our individual identities.
Yeah.
It is what the rest of the world needs to hear, but it is something, unless we believe it ourselves, it doesn't matter. We have to believe it. We cannot pit ourselves against each other. It's not a value. It's an America. If we want to be multicultural, multiracial, we have to believe what multicultural and multiracial means, not my community versus your community, my American community versus your American community. We are American, and we're different individually, but we have a collective identity we can create. We get to write that story. And what I hope we walk away from here is that you don't have to have the story written about you. You can be a part of writing it. So be an active part of writing this story.
That is a wonderful sentence to end on. I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank all of you for being here. And hopefully the conversation will continue. Thank you.
Great.